Hi team, welcome back. This is lesson 3.2, Production Possibilities Frontier with Miss Purcell. So for this lesson, we're going to illustrate and explain the production possibility frontier model, and we're going to outline the three basic economic questions. But before we get into the model, I want to quickly just touch on using models in economics. So in this lesson and in many lessons to come, you will use models frequently in order to make sense of economic change and try and sort of understand the consequences of certain economic decision making. Models are representations of reality that are presented in a simplified way. Life is not simple. There are many variables bearing down on us all the time. And the challenge for us in economics is we try to isolate a single variable and speak to the consequence that it's likely to have in this particular scenario. The reason I'm saying all this is because if we ever look at a model and you're thinking, well, okay, it looks good on paper, but in reality, I don't actually think that's how it would go. I want you to take it with a grain of salt and think, okay, well, if the world stopped for a moment and this was the only variable that, we were experiencing, then actually this is likely to be the outcome. But in reality, we know that it's much more complex than that. So I think this sort of speaks to some of the issues, I suppose, associated with economics and the complexity behind economic thought and the challenge for governments in trying to understand how the decisions that they make actually will impact society, knowing full well that there's a whole bunch of other things going on that could impact it. So economists frequently use models to try to explain the relationship between ideas, explain theories, or show real world connections. But like I said, take it with a grain of salt. If you think in your real world context it might look different, there's every chance that it does. Okay, so this is the model that we're going to focus on for this lesson. This is the production possibilities frontier, okay? Just take a moment to have a really, really good look at this model, okay? You've got your X and Y axes, and on your X and Y axes, we've got two goods. In this case, we've got food and clothing. And the idea is that we want to use this model to have an understanding of, in this particular scenario, let's call it an economy, how could they best use their resources in order to come up with a combination of outputs such that they're maximizing the wants and needs of society, okay? So if we look at point B and just look at the maths for a moment, right? If we look at point B, we can see that if we choose to produce 100 units of food, then we are going to produce 0 units of clothing. And that maybe that's fine. Maybe that's what the economy wants and that's what it decides to do. It's not good or bad. It's just a fact, okay? If we move to point C, we can see it starts to get a little bit more diverse. So we can choose to produce 75 units of food, and that's going to produce 100 units of clothing. Keep in mind, these are the resources, the combination of resources, the land, labour, capital, and enterprise, all being combined together in order to produce this level of output. Now, I also want to make it clear, it's not a numbers game. We're not trying to, maximise the physical number. We're not saying that 100 units of food is worse than 75 units of food plus 100 units of clothing, ergo 175 units. We're not saying 175 trumps 100. That's not the case. What we're doing is we're just trying to understand what are the combinations of output that we can achieve in this economy. How much food can I produce? And if I choose that number, how much clothing can I then produce? And obviously, the position along the curve that is decided is obviously going to be dictated by the demand within that economy, because suppliers will want to produce what's demanded because ultimately they're driven by profits, okay? So the key takeaway, I think, right now, that was a lot of information, but the key takeaway from this slide is that anywhere along this curve is where your economy wants to sit, okay? I'm not saying you need to be at B or C or D or A, but you want to be at least one of them, right? You don't want to be below it, and I'll explain why in a moment. You want to be on the curve, because on the curve suggests that you are using your scarce resources to the best of your ability. And if you're doing that, you are best able to satisfy the wants and needs of society, okay? Things to note, you're only going to deal with two goods or services, which, like I said before, is, not realistic. You're going to be dealing in the real world with a combination of millions of products. But for simplicity's sake, we just have an X and Y axes, and we just attribute two goods and services across those axes. Okay, so same graph, nothing's changed here. And we've spoken to point B and ultimately point C, and D and A are similar. So if we go to point D, we can produce 50 units of food and 150 units of clothing. Depending on the demand in the economy, maybe that's where we're going to sit. But if we're sitting at D, we're happy with that because we are maximising the use of our resources. There's 2 points on this graph I want to point out that cause issues for us, okay? Point E is first and foremost not where we want to be, okay? At point E, we have got what we call idle resources that are not being used, okay? So you might take your labor resources and they might be unemployed. You might take your capital resources and they might not be switched on. They might not be used. They might be abandoned or shut down, okay? Even your land resources, there's obviously issues related to sustainability, but in essence, we might have some resources that are of the land that are also being underutilized. So if you have a situation where resources are being underutilized, ask yourself the question, are we maximizing output? Well, no, we're not. Okay. And so if we're not maximizing output, we're not sitting on the curve. We might be sitting at point E. So the thing that's unique about point E is it's below the curve. Point E could be anywhere below the curve. The point that point E is trying to make is that it represents the underutilization of resources. And if we wind back to the basic economic problem, ask yourself, if we're not maximizing output, how are we compromising the basic economic problem? Are we satisfying society's wants and needs to the best of our ability? And the answer is no. Okay. So if this was a government and they came in and they saw this and they went, right, we're all working at point E, they'd go, well, what can we do to employ those idle resources such that we can shift E out until eventually it hits the curve and we're back to business as usual. Point F is interesting. Point F in the short run cannot be achieved. Okay. It's beyond the curve. So if you were looking at this today, anywhere along the curve, we know that's the maximum level of output, right? We cannot go beyond it. However, we can plan for it. So in the long run, we can potentially get to F if we carefully plan. So I'm going to show you this graph here. This graph has the PPF shifting out to the right. So in the long run, the economy can plan to increase output. This involves increasing the quality and or the quantity of the factors of production. So let's go back to labor for a moment, right? Land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Let's look at labor exclusively. What could we or what could the government do in order to increase the quality and the quantity of labor resources? They might decide to spend more money on education, right? If they do that, then there's a chance that the labor resources that are entering the workforce at any given point in time are more productive, right? They're better educated, so they're more productive, so they're able to achieve more output. Okay, so we've got the same number of labor resources, but they're working harder, and as a result of that, we're getting more output. And if we're getting more output, then we're able to shift the whole PPF out to the right over the long run. Similar with capital, we might invest in capital. We might go and buy more machines. We might go overseas and see what they're doing and bring those practices back here. And ultimately, the capital equipment that we've got, we might be able to make it better such that we're able to achieve more output and shift that PPF to the right. So when we're able to do that, we're able to achieve more output across any combination along the B curve, right? And then ultimately that's going to support improvements in satisfying the wants and needs of society. Okay, so point F, if I go back to this graph, not achievable in the short run, but we can plan for it in the long run in the sense that we can push the whole curve out to the right. So we've got two multis to have a look at. An increase in Australia's skilled migration intake is likely to result in. Now, before I even look at the answers, I just want to get my head around that. Like, what does that mean? Okay. So we've got more skilled immigrants coming into the country, coming into Australia. We're dealing with a situation where we've got more labour resources coming in, so an increase in the quantity of labour. Not only that, they're skilled, so we've got an increase in the quality of labour. So if you think about your factors of production, if we see an increase in the quality and quantity of labour, what's that going to do to output? It should increase it. And what's that going to do to the PPF? It's going to shift it to the right. So before I even go through the solutions, I've already had a consideration of what that sentence means. So I'm sort of locked and loaded, and I'm looking for that. I'm hunting for that in these responses, okay? So A, we can see it, a shift to the PPF to the right. That looks awesome. That's what we just spoke about. So I'm thinking the answer is going to be A. But like I said, we need to go through everything just to make sure. B, an increase in skills shortages. Actually, we're going to see a decrease in skills shortages because we're getting more skilled migrants into the country. C, an increase in the unemployment rate. Doesn't really make sense. We've got migrants coming into the country. They're not necessarily replacing anybody else. It's just the case that we've got gaps in our labour system and they're filling those gaps. So it won't touch the unemployment rate. It's got nothing to do with it. And you may not know what this term means yet, but D, an increase in intertemporal efficiency. I'll explain what intertemporal efficiency is in my next video. At this stage, just know that this is not it. If you take on more skilled migrants, it's not going to touch your intertemporal efficiency. So the answer is A, all right? I hope that makes sense. Okay, and then the second question, all other things being equal, which one of the following is most likely to result in a shift in the country's PPF to the left? Okay, we haven't looked at this scenario. We've only really looked at scenarios where the PPF shifts to the right, ergo output is increasing over time. It can go the other way. If you have issues with the quality and or the quantity of your factors of production into the long run, there's an argument to say that, yeah, you're going to reduce your productive capacity. I mean, if we think of the Australian bushfires and all the infrastructure that was wiped out in that, crisis, you could argue that in those areas, we're going to see a shift to the left of the PPF because there's a reduction in that area's ability to produce output. More broadly, if you're dealing with adverse weather conditions or instances of war, you're going to see a reduction in the quality and or the quantity, usually the quantity of your resources, and that's going to shift the PPF to the left. So once again, just good to know before we go into it, right? So I'm looking for something that's going to reduce output. So let's go through them. So a decrease in consumer confidence. Not that we've gone through what consumer confidence is yet, but a shift to the left will not be caused by that, okay? It doesn't touch it. An increase in the unemployment rate. Now, this one's interesting, right? I went back to this slide here, and we said that at point E, there was an underemployment of resources, and that may be due to an increase in unemployment, or it may cause an increase in unemployment. It doesn't really matter either way. So we're shifting in the sense that we're dealing with a point on the graph that's not on the curve, but note that it doesn't shift the entire curve. It just sits underneath it, okay? So it can't be B, because the increase in the unemployment rate just suggests that resources are idle. It doesn't mean that output's being reduced into the long run. So not B, C, an increase in the number of people retiring from paid employment. Now this one looks good. Let's break it down. There's an increase in the number of people retiring from paid employment. Retiring, right? So they're exiting the workforce. So the quantity of labour resource is going to decrease because more individuals are putting up their hand to retire. So think about your factors of production for a moment. Go to your labour and think, right, decrease in quantity of labour, decrease in resources, that's going to decrease output. And if we decrease our output, we're going to see that PPF shift to the left. So C is looking really good, but as always, I'm going to go through D just to confirm. A change in consumer preferences towards bigger houses. That's so random. No idea what that even means, okay? It's really got nothing to do with it. So to me, C is looking very good. I wanted to put this here because I want to speak to, it's lovely that we've just gone through all that information, but what do you actually need to do with it beyond a multi-choice question, okay? So have a look here. You've got a table and it's got 6 data points and it's got the associated coordinates. And if you look at the top axes, it basically says that you're dealing with 2 products. You're dealing with wheat and wine. So we're dealing with the production of wheat as in tons per week. And we're dealing with the production of wine, that is thousands of bottles per week. And then we've got a whole bunch of numbers that basically tell us all the different combinations that we can achieve in producing either combination of those 2 products. Okay, so there's more to this question, but I just want to speak to part A. If you have a look at the axes, you're being asked to basically create the PPF based on the data that you've been given, okay? I'll start by saying this. You must use a scale, okay? You need to use a scale because you need to be able to demonstrate along your scale how those combinations of output change across the curve. The other piece is that in parts B and C of this question, which we will look at later, there are questions related to other points on the graph. And if you haven't mapped it out properly, you're not going to be able to derive consequences. So long story short, get a ruler and chuck a scale in. Now, when I was doing it, I looked at it and went, right, I went from 0 to 6,000. I'm going to use a 1 centimetre scale, and each centimetre is going to represent 1,000 tonnes of wheat produced per week. And that's what I've got here on my y-axis, right? 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and so on. And I've made it really clear what this axis is because I've labelled it. So that's another key component when you answer this question. You must label your axes so I understand what combination I'm looking at and how it all works. If you don't put the label there, then 6,000 what, all right? And it's not good enough just to put wheat. You have to say that it's tons per week because that's the unit of measurement that we need to know against the number on the axes, okay? So basically, just copy this heading here, pop it here. You can even put production of, not a big deal. You can put that in there if you want. And then obviously use your ruler, your centimetre scale, or if it's bigger, that's fine. It's up to you. But make it really clear what that is. Same deal on the x-axis, okay? So I'm dealing with 0 to 700, so I've just used 7 centimetres and I've said that each centimetre is worth 100. And then I've gone and plotted all the points along this PPF, okay? So point A, I'm just going to check it. If I've made sense of this, I've said that we're going to produce 6,000 tonnes of wheat per week and 0,000 wine bottles per week. So if I go back and check that against my data here, I can see that I've got that one correct. Let's just do one more. If I pick point D, I can see that I'm dealing with 3,000 tonnes of wheat and I'm dealing with 500,000 bottles of wine. So D, 3,000, 550. Ooh, I've made a little mistake there. That D should be a little bit closer to the right, but you get my point, all right? So please make sure you're able to use your graph paper to make it really clear what goes where. Use that scale, use a pencil, bring an eraser, and make it really clear to the examiner where those points are on the PPF. The last part for these slides, guys, that I'd like to speak to is the 3 economic questions. So these will come up no matter where you study economics. They're kind of some of the not philosophical underpinnings, but it's our job as economists to try and answer these questions to the best of our ability, okay? So based on scarce resources and unlimited wants and needs, we're dealing with a situation where we want to know, what are we producing? And how do we make those decisions around what we're producing? So are we going to use all the available land to grow crops? Or is some of it going to be used to build factories to produce shoes? Who decides what we're going to, produce, and how do we make that assumption? Now, how do we make that assumption? Have a think about it for a moment. What is it that drives producers to produce goods and services? Money, right? So, economics, when we think about sort of rational economic agent thought, we know that producers are always seeking to maximize profits. There's a little bit more to it. You might have some social enterprises. You might have different sort of motivations by businesses, but ultimately they're there to make money. All right. So what to produce, depending on the market structure, is generally answered by, well, where's the money? That's going to help us to understand how we're able to maximize profits and respond to consumer demand. The next question is, how are we going to produce? So if we decide to produce crops, what combination of factors of production and what technology should we use to produce them? So if we go back to our resources, right, we've got our capital resources, we've got our labor resources. What combination of those resources will we use to produce a good or service? And what's going to motivate the decision behind how we make those allocations? So think about it for a moment. What would a producer do? They're likely to pick the methodology that's going to allow them to minimize cost whilst maintaining their quality. Ultimately, because once again, they're looking to maximize profits. But again, it's not that straightforward, right? Like, you go all over the world, there's a whole different ways that question's answered. And once again, it's about making sure that you do so in a manner that best satisfies the wants and needs of society, okay? And then finally, the last question is pretty interesting. Which goods are going to be consumed only by those who can pay for them? So who are we going to produce the goods for? Are we only going to do it for people that can pay for it? Now, that makes sense, right? If you can't pay for it, you shouldn't really have access to it. If you think about a market structure, I can't just rock into Westfield and take something home without paying for it. Or I can, but obviously I've broken the law in doing so, okay? But it's bigger than that, right? Governments come in and they say, no, people should have access to education. They should have access to healthcare. They should have access to a whole bunch of different things, irrespective of their income level. So if we just left it up to the free market without any government intervention, we might find ourselves in a situation where some people are cut off from accessing what we call merit goods, or goods that have positive impacts to the individual or society. Whereas governments often come in and say, no, there's an argument here to say that we do need to support certain individuals having access to certain services and goods, because that's fair and equitable. That's what we need to do. So it's not as straightforward as yes and no, and do we supply it or not? And there's a whole political undertone to this as well. But markets, once again, do help us to try and understand who we're going to produce the good for. So these are your 3 basic economic questions. You're not expected to answer them, right? They are those, like I said, sort of philosophical underpinnings of economics, but they do sort of relate back nicely to the basic economic problem. Cool. Catch you in the next video.